for most people possible. We're probably going to sit more towards the back.
Oh, there we go. We're gonna use that as an additional.
Yeah, instead of, you know, we used to have that goofy little camera. This is our new fancy replacement.
Sweet. Perfect.
I can get down with this one. You're officially a co-host.
It's so blurry. Am I actually blurry or is that just the camera?
No, yeah, it's the camera.
Sure.
Probably with the light connection too.
I feel kind of blurry right now.
Just a little.
Yes.
I was just thinking that.
I was just planning on access to
I mean, last time it. The computer, okay? Your dad? Yeah, he said, like, he can hear me okay, but anytime when anyone spoke back there. Yeah, I mean, people might just have to yell if they sit back there. Yeah, or repeat it. I guess that's an option. That's what I was thinking. I think we used to have one, but I don't know, we're not really totally on Zoom anymore. So yeah, let's have him share his screen. Oh, no, it's okay. And it should be fine. Dr. Dow, I did my Watts interview today.
What was that?
I feel good about it.
Good.
There's like 6 different people. What? There he is. Hello.
Hey, what's up?
Oh.
Hey,
Hello.
Brandon.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh. I think you might have to connect it to the. We can hear you. It's just quiet, so we're gonna.
Okay.
Would you mind saying something again?
Yeah, I can keep talking.
Is that fine? Maybe. Yeah. The problem is I have to say join with computer audio.
Maybe
Wait.
connect the computer to the.
Well, it is connected. Oh, it's try to turn off the music. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
We can hear you, but we're trying to make it louder.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go get some water and switch chairs since this one's creaky. So
Okay.
I'll be there in like 2 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Cool.
Logistically, I'm not sure how we're gonna get that to work.
Well, the audio should go through the television.
Oh yeah, speakers.
So go to audio and then make the speakers the television Samsung.
I gotta make.
Okay, I'm back.
I mean, I might just have to. I might just have to mute it every time we ask questions.
How we doing out there?
Going.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's fine. All right. We're gonna try to work out.
Okay, cool. And do I need to be a co-host in order to share my screen?
I don't believe so.
You can just make him a co-host.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, hold on. It looks like I can share my screen. Hold on.
Yeah, try it.
Can you see it?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay,
That's great.
awesome. Cool. So we're good to
Gonna
go.
move
I will stop sharing.
I'm just gonna change some settings.
Sure.
You have your boombox connect the iPad to?
Yeah. Where's the settings? Here.
Can you hear this?
I can hear you.
Can you hear the music?
No, I can't, which is fine as long as you all can hear it. But
Hear it. And you.
I don't know if I've ever played music on Zoom before. So
All right. Can you see us?
yeah, I can see you. So are you all just in like a lounge right now, basically? Or like a room somewhere?
I have to leave early, but I didn't want to interrupt it. Thank you, though.
Can't be the only one. I'm gonna say that to you. Yay.
How comfortable is that couch?
Actually, let me check. It's actually not bad. Yeah, I approve. Hello. Cool.
Yeah. Yes.
I know people did see it, or they will see it, right?
Yes. I will. So like you added up individually, but it's different.
Okay. What? Enchanted? I thought for a second I thought he was playing Taylor Swift. I was like, what's that? This is that. I didn't recognize. I don't recognize it at all. Huh. Okay. You rock her?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that what you're using?
Yeah.
Okay. This is week 7 already. Oh, yeah, 7.
Are we directly halfway through? I guess it's why
We're almost,
midterms are
yeah.
happening.
I know. All right, well, why don't we begin? Welcome everyone to the Wednesday afternoon field-centered discussion. Today we have Dr. Brandon Blight, who is associate professor, chair of philosophy at Knox College, and specializes in aesthetics and especially the aesthetics of Taylor Swift, and is editing a book on Taylor Swift recordings, and is also published on music ontology, on aesthetics of music, an article called Sharing Music Experiences, Sharing Musical Experiences, very strong aesthetics. So let's give Brandon a warm welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can people hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. So I am going to share my screen and then we'll just get into it. Okay. Okay, people can see my screen. We're all good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So what I am talking about today shouldn't come as a surprise given the title, is Taylor Swift's project of re-recording her albums and the philosophical implications. And in particular, I'm going to focus on some of the metaphysical implications of her doing this. And so I think the best way to get into it is just to start with a hypothetical case. And so imagine that you're at a club and you have a DJ with a classic 2 turntable set up and she's spinning records all night. And at some point, she puts on Taylor Swift's Enchanted. You're listening to it, you're enjoying it. It's all good. But unbeknownst to you, she has 2 different copies of the album, one on each turntable. She synced them up so they start playing at the exact same time. And she's cutting back and forth at, regular or irregular intervals over the course of the song's duration. But to you, it seems like you were just listening to Enchanted as you normally would, right? Single copy playing all the way through. This is a peculiar case. This is an odd thing for a DJ to do, is to be spinning 2 copies of the exact same record, not as a way of like extending drum breaks or something of that sort, but just to cut back and forth, right? And so that's peculiar, but what she's doing, the DJ, isn't technically difficult, right? Anyone with that setup and just the ability to press play, on 2 things at the, 2 records at the same time would be able to do this. And she isn't doing anything really aesthetically dubious, right? You're hearing a single track, but that track is just distributed across 2 copies of the album. And we all know that albums come in multiple copies. Some albums, have a short run of pressing. Some have, millions of copies exist, right? With Taylor Swift's Enchanted, millions of copies of that track exist, right? And we all know that. And so it's a bit peculiar, but there's nothing really technically, metaphysically, aesthetically confusing going on. But then let's switch the case, right? It's black and white. It's coming from the left. Therefore, something dubious is happening. So imagine you have a similar sort of situation. You're at a club, DJ, 2 turntables, she's spinning records. You listen to Enchanted, you enjoy it, it's fun. But in this alternate case, she isn't spinning 2 copies of the same recording, right? Enchanted from Speak Now, which Taylor Swift released in 2010. Rather, she's spinning a copy of the original recording, and she's spinning a copy of Enchanted Taylor's version, which was released in July of this year, 2023, so 13 years after the original. But to you, it seemed as if you were hearing one continuous track. In this case, the DJ is once again not doing anything technically difficult, challenging, right? Just the ability to sync up the albums and spin them at the same time and cut in between them. Anyone with the technology would be capable of doing that. But she does seem to be doing something aesthetically dubious, right? You're hearing 2 distinct recordings being cut back and forth between, but it seems to you as if you're listening to a single continuous recording. And in a sense, what she's done is she's mashed up these 2 recordings, right? She has created a spontaneous or extemporaneous mashup of these 2 tracks. But to you, it sounds like you're just listening to one track, right? The track that you grew up with, Enchanted from Speak Now. So in this case, excuse me, the DJ is doing something dubious, doing something really peculiar, metaphysically and aesthetically, I'm going to suggest. But the weirdness of what this DJ is doing in my hypothetical scenario owes entirely to the weirdness of what Taylor Swift is doing in real life, right? Taylor Swift is re-recording her first 6 studio albums basically to duplicate them, to make them sound, the new versions sound basically the same, such that you could swap out the new versions with the originals and most people wouldn't notice the difference. For those of you in the room, Jamie was playing Enchanted, but what he may not have told you is that it's a version of Enchanted on YouTube where the left channel is entirely the original version, the right channel is entirely the re-recording, and they're synced up, right? And this is an example where I at least can't tell the difference, right? It sounds like one continuous track to me, at least. And so, you know, a real DJ could do exactly what I described, and most listeners wouldn't notice that she's cutting between 2 distinct tracks recorded at 2 different times, 13 years apart. Okay, so I've made a word cloud. Rather than having a slide or multiple slides with a bunch of text, I'm just going to talk through briefly, for those of you who might not be familiar, about why Taylor Swift is doing what she's doing. And so in 2019, Taylor Swift's former record label, Big Machine Records, where she recorded her first 6 studio albums, was sold to Ithaca Holdings, which is a holding company owned by Scooter Braun. And for those of you who don't know, Scooter Braun is a really famous music promoter and music manager. Recently, he's been in the news because several of his high-profile clients have left him, including Ariana Grande. And I think there's still rumors about whether Justin Bieber left him. I don't know if that's been confirmed. But importantly to our story is that he was also Kanye West's manager. Now, anyone who knows anything about Taylor Swift probably knows she has a history with Kanye West, right? Tracing back to the Music Video Awards at MTV, when he famously got on the stage and said that Beyonce made the best music video of all time, therefore Taylor Swift doesn't deserve the award. Now, regardless of whether what Kanye was saying was correct, obviously at the time it was very inappropriate, very shocking. And fast forward to Kanye West releasing a track, the name of which I just blanked on, where he claims that he made Taylor Swift famous. Okay, that's a lyric on the track. He also calls her a bitch on that track, right? And Taylor Swift put out in the media that she wasn't okay with this, right? She wasn't, okay with him calling her a bitch, saying that he's responsible for her being famous rather than her hard work and talent, etc. And subsequent to that, Kim Kardashian, this is like celebrity gossip right now, which people may be familiar with. Kim Kardashian released audio of a phone call between Kanye and Taylor Swift, where she very much seemed to be saying, sure, Kanye, you can call me a bitch, and sure, Kanye, you can take credit for my fame, right? Turns out that allegedly, at least, Scooter Braun helped to release that audio, and the audio of the phone call had been edited deceptively to make it seem like Taylor Swift was saying something that she, in fact, hadn't said. And so Taylor Swift has, I'll say it, years of bad blood with Scooter Braun. And when her former label, which owned the masters and therefore the right to reproduce and sell and make money off of her first 6 studio albums, was sold to Scooter Braun's holding company, she posted on Tumblr, a lengthy response about how Scooter Braun, this person who spent years essentially bullying her and trying to harm her career and harm her reputation, now is going to be able to benefit financially from work he played no part in, right? He wasn't there when she was writing or recording these albums, right? If anything, he was trying to hinder her career. And now he's standing to make potentially hundreds of millions of dollars off of her first 6 studio albums, right? And so in response to this, Taylor Swift decided to re-record her first 6 studio albums and put them on Spotify, urge her fans and other people to listen to the new versions, to urge radio stations to play the new Taylor's versions, is what she calls them, of the tracks instead of the originals. She got a commitment from iHeartRadio, which is probably the largest radio company in the United States, to anytime she releases a new version, they're only going to play the new version, right? And so that's the backstory. And so far, she's released 3 of them. Fearless, Taylor's version, Red, Taylor's version, both from 2021. Speak Now, Taylor's version, as I mentioned, she released in July of this year. And 1989, Taylor's version is going to be released, what day is today? The 4th, 23 days from now, on October 27th. So just before Halloween. And any Swifties out there who can do math might notice that Fearless and Speak Now were released 13 years. The Taylor's versions were released 13 years after the original, and 13 is Taylor Swift's lucky number. So there seems to be a significance there, maybe. I don't know. Whatever. I'm not into numerology. So this leads to a lot of questions, a lot of issues, and I'll touch on some other ones just very briefly at the end. But one of the questions it raises is just to point out, look, the re-recordings sound pretty much the same as the originals, right? If you could, as my imaginary DJ did, cut back and forth, which someone very much could do, and most listeners wouldn't be able to tell the difference, then why aren't the Taylor's versions just instances of the original albums, hence the original albums in black and white here, as opposed to their actual covers? Right. So that's a metaphysical question, right? Aren't they just instances of the original albums? And there are a couple ways of thinking about this. One is to say that, yes, they are. Excuse me, I'm having like major allergy problems. Yes, they are, in a sense. So to think about it this way, albums are abstract entities, right? Like yeah, there's a copy of an album here, copy of an album there. There are millions of copies of Taylor Swift's albums throughout the world, but none of them is the singular album, right? It's not like the Mona Lisa, which is hanging on the wall in the Louvre, right? It's, distributed throughout the world. If we lose one copy of, Taylor Swift's, Red Taylor's version, right, the album hasn't like shrunk in size by one or something of that sort, right? So albums are abstract entities. Further, albums are collections of songs, right? You have this track listing in this order. Songs are just basically compositions plus words, right? Therefore, given just these two assumptions, since the original albums and Taylor Swift's re-recordings of them, the Taylor's versions of those albums, contain the same songs, it seems as though we should say they're instances of the same album, right? I'm skipping over just mainly because I forgot, but there's a view in the history of aesthetics called formalism, which assumes that any two objects that are perceptually identical are therefore one and the same work of art. Monroe Beardsley held this view. Clive Bell held this view sort of earlier part of the 20th century, right? And that argument really doesn't apply directly to Taylor's versions because none of them sound exactly the same. If you listen carefully to them, you will be able to spot some differences here and there. And so the album, the fact that they don't sound identical means that the formalism argument fails to get off the ground. But in general, no one accepts that version of formalism anymore. There have been so many arguments since Arthur Danto, Jerry Levinson, Amy Thomason, et cetera, who just argue that this version or this position is just entirely untenable, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But this is the one other argument one could make, right? Is the albums are collections of songs. Taylor's versions and the originals have the same track listing, same songs, same lyrics by and large, same compositions, same vibe, same sound, et cetera. So we should think of them as instances of the same album, right? And so that would mean that what Taylor Swift has done is produced a new copy, right? Or a new set of copies of, say, Red from 2012 by re-recording it, right? Just in the way that if I download the file and copy it and send it to you, I've created a new copy of it, right? If what Taylor Swift has done is created a new instance of the album, that's essentially all she's done. She's, done this very complicated process that could have just been by hitting copy and paste. But now the sort of, right? Yeah, albums are collections of songs if we think of them in those terms. But albums aren't merely collections of songs. Albums are recordings. They're things that we can buy, that we can stream, that we can listen to, that we can share, that we can copy, that we can download, that we can send legally or illegally to other people. We can collect them, right? The type of album, qua abstract entity, qua collection of songs, this is a very fancy word here, ontologically thin object, right? It's just a set of songs collected together, right? And songs, again, just lyrics plus composition, right? Something you can find in sheet music, right? And so given this understanding, right, a book of just sheet music would count as an instance of the album, given this sort of thin conception. But albums are actually thicker things, right? Ontologically thicker things, right? They're recordings, they're sounds, they have particular, based on particular historical events happening in recording studios, et cetera. And so it's better to think of Taylor's versions and the originals as distinct versions of one and the same album, where, album in this sense being the sort of thin conception of, collection of songs, right? Yeah, they instance that, right, in some sense. But because they're different recordings, right, or based on different recordings, they are different albums in this thick sense. And so the thing I'm just trying to convey here is that we have two different conceptions of albums, one thin, one thick. And when we talk about albums, we are typically talking about the thick things, right? The things we can buy and listen to, right? That's what matters to our actual practices surrounding, popular music. Here's another example, right? if albums were just collections of songs, right, then Angelique Kidjo's version of Remain in Light would be buying a copy of that would be the same as buying a copy of Talking Heads' original Remain in Light. Right, her version, which is absolutely amazing, I highly recommend it, is like an Afrobeat. She's from Benin, right? It's an Afrobeat version, cover version, right? It's a cover album of the original, right? Different recording, radically different style, right? Or to take an example from Taylor Swift, right? Ryan Adams, who I hesitate to mention, but just look on Google up Ryan Adams plus a groomer, and you'll see why I hesitate to mention him. But he recorded a cover album version of 1989, which contains all of the tracks from Taylor Swift's original from the previous year, but in his own particular style, right? Sort of slow alt rock, moody alt rock, as opposed to 1989, which is, a hard pop banger of an album. Right. If we're thinking of albums thinly as mere collections of songs, both of these cover albums have the same set of songs as the originals, but the cover albums aren't copies of the original albums, right? They're distinct sort of things, and we refer to them as cover versions, right? And so it's better to think of them as, versions of the same thin, conception of album, but in the thick conception, they are different albums, right? Same title, same track listing, same songs, thinly specified, but they are distinct albums ontologically. So here then is the right way, I think, to think about it, right? Or the better way to think about it. And here I'm following almost anyone working in philosophy of recorded music today. And so that's, stemming from Gerald Levinson, Ted Graysick, Andrew Kania, etc., right? That Taylor's versions and the originals are different albums because they have different histories of production, right? To produce a copy of Red, for example, from 2012, would be to copy the audio file, right? That, if we have a digital master of the original, copy that file or copy a copy of that file digitally, right? That's one way to make a copy of it. You don't make a copy and thus an instance of Red by sitting in a studio and recording track after track after track after track, splicing them together to produce something that sounds just like it, right? And so Taylor's versions in that sense are not instances of the original albums thickly understood, right? Thinly they are, right? They're same track listing, same songs, but thickly they are different recordings, even though the recordings sound exactly the same to the extent that they do, right? Different means of reproduction, as I just said, right? So different histories of production, different means of reproduction. She reproduced the album differently than, copying and pasting a digital file. She had musicians in the studio recording their parts and so on. And so it follows from this then that Taylor's versions aren't identical to the originals. They're different legal entities, they're different economic entities, they're different aesthetic entities. We appreciate them differently, knowing that, she had and her team, right, produced faithful reproductions through the way that she did, right? We hold those to a different standard than we would the originals, right? With Fearless, for example, right? She released that when she was 18, 19, versus Fearless Taylor version when she was like 32, right? And so different standards apply to teenagers versus grown adults, right? And so they are distinct albums. And so I'm not going to read this quote. That's not why I put this up here. But, if I were just to sit down and type out Jane Austen's Emma, I will have produced an instance of it. I will have produced a copy of Emma, right? So long as I get the letters in the right order, the words in the right order, the punctuation correct, I have produced an instance of it. And that's a legitimate way of producing a copy of a novel. But with music, right, sitting down and recording take after take after take and splicing those takes together is not a way of producing a copy, an instance of an album, right? You, through doing that, because different process of reproduction, different history of production, have produced a new album, even if it sounds exactly the same, right? That's the important thing. Even if it sounds exactly the same, it's a different album. Whereas with novels, I could write it out by hand. Novels, books, texts used to be written out entirely by hand, right? Old time before the Gutenberg printing press, that's how, texts were copied out, and you're producing legitimate instances of them, right? With music and recorded music in particular, it's a different ontology because we have a different set of practices. So here's the upshot. Taylor's versions and the originals are the same albums in the thin sense of being collections of songs, but they're different albums in the sense that they are different recordings, right? And recordings are the important thing when we're dealing with popular music, which is recorded music. So that's like the main thing. And so the upshot, and this is a thing that I would like to talk more with you all about, is that two albums can sound exactly the same, and this is what Taylor Swift's project is helping to reveal, and yet be distinct albums. Okay, I think actually like the converse of this is true too, or maybe not converse, but that you could have two albums that sound different, but actually be this one in the same album. But that's a separate issue that we could talk about if you want to. I'm thinking about like a remaster, right? You take like Bob Dylan's first albums were released in mono. If you remaster them for stereo, it's going to sound different, but I think they're the same albums in that case. So, the perceptual qualities of the thing are less important than the way in which it was produced, right? Based on the recordings. That's the main upshot. And so if you're interested more in Taylor Swift's re-recording project and the philosophical implications of it, as Jamie mentioned at the beginning, I've got a book on that coming out that I'm editing for Bloomsbury. It should be out late next year. 10 chapters. Are there 13 of us? Oh, that's fortuitous. There's 13 of us writing 10 chapters that explore not just metaphysical issues like I am, but also issues of morals, justice, meaning, fan reception, parasocial relationships between Taylor Swift and her fans. Lee David Elliott Cray has written a fantastic chapter on how we should understand these albums. So Fearless, for example, Taylor's version, if we go back to the beginning, Fearless Taylor's version, if you look at the cover, that's very much her in like Evermore folklore vibe, right? Indie pop, folksy, woodsy, right? And so like we're getting folklore era Taylor recording Fearless era Taylor again. And so there's a question of persona and personhood, and as that relates. So there's, going to be a lot of great stuff there. And just one other plug. So the book was based on a series of discussions I did for my YouTube series, which is called Polite Conversations, Philosophers Discussing Art. If you just search Philosophers Discussing Art, you'll find the channel. The latest episode I have a picture of right here, and it's someone in the room with y'all on nature aesthetics. And it's a really, really fucking good one. So definitely check that out unless, you're sick of that guy. But otherwise, thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Awesome. So I will stop sharing my screen, and then if people want me to share it again, I can. But so what's the procedure now?
Basically, we open it up for discussion. People have questions, want to talk about anything. Have comments, want to share favorite Taylor Swift songs or albums or whatever.
What led you to study at Taylor Swift, like the philosophy of Taylor Swift?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question that well.
What inspired you to study the philosophy of Taylor Swift? Philosophy or?
Good. So it's not because antecedently I was a Swiftie. It was definitely not that. I I never really listened to Taylor Swift's music prior to thinking about her philosophically. I'd heard it now and then, especially the stuff from 1989. I thought it was perfectly fine, but it just wasn't what I was into. And so I'd been thinking about issues pertaining to re-recording for a while prior to Taylor Swift announcing that she was going to be re-recording her back catalog. And so in, I think, 2012, the 80s British glam metal band Def Leppard had a dispute with Universal Music, their record company, because the record company would not release any of their catalog onto iTunes. And thus they were losing out on potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of digital music sales. And so in response, Def Leppard re-recorded two of their biggest hits, Pour Some Sugar on Me and Rock of Ages, and they released them, and they are stunningly good. Like, they sound exactly like the originals. It is scary how good they did it. And what's interesting there is the fact that Joe Elliott, the lead singer, right, we're talking 30 years later. So he's aged 30 years, meaning his voice has aged 30 years. And so he had to relearn how to sing as a 20-year-old in his 50s, right? And so just like that is what got me interested. And then I sort of found other cases. And so the American 80s glam rock band Journey from New Jersey re-recorded their greatest hits. There we go. Right. I threw that out just for Jamie. Right. Re-recorded their greatest hits with their new lead singer who replaced Steve Perry. Right. Who's like a sound-alike guy. Right. They found him like on Indonesia, the Philippines, like American Idol. Right. Like that version. Right. Like this dude sounded exactly like Steve Perry. And so they hired him as their new lead singer because he'd retired from singing. And they were, re-recorded their greatest hits, right, with a new singer who sounds exactly like their original singer, right? And other artists have done this. This was somewhat common practice in the 1960s. And so if you got signed to a new record label, right, your new label would want to capitalize on your past success, right? And so they would hastily have you go in the studio, re-record your greatest hits, and they'd release a greatest hits compilation. Right. What's interesting about Taylor Swift's case is that, as far as I know, right, all of the others that have been released in the past, in both 1960s and the 2000s, all of the re-recordings that have been released have been either single tracks or else it's been greatest hit compilations. No one, as far as I know, has re-recorded an entire album, from first track to last track. And then not only done it once, but is planning to do it 6 times total, right? And so Swift's project is really impressive. And further, what's impressive about it is what some of the authors in the book will be dealing with, is the way in which he's taking on the recording industry, right? Which is a deeply exploitative industry, right? And so, for example, typical record contracts, right, sort of cut $13.87, and so for every sale of an album, you, the artist, get 13% of profits. The record company gets 87%, right? Further, when Taylor Swift first signed, she first signed at the age of, I think, 14, not as an artist performer, but as a songwriter. And this is really messed up. So in order to get a songwriting contract with Sony, she had to give them 90% of every song she wrote for them. So that means songs that she wrote in junior high math class, thinking about Tim McGraw, for example, which is her first hit, right? Sony owns 90% of that, which is a weird thing to own, right? You now own this poem, right? Plus guitar chords that I wrote as a 13-year-old in 7th grade math class, right? Like, So, she's really helping to expose through this project just how messed up the recording industry is and how really unjust and unfair the whole situation is with respect to money. And the fact that someone's catalog could be sold against their will to someone they despise, right, as happened to her, right, really helps to bring that home. And the way that she's responding to it is just incredibly impressive to me. And so that's how I got into Taylor Swift, was by Taylor Swift doing this thing that I think is awesome and therefore philosophically interesting.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So is re-recording an issue of status for people who make it far enough in the industry? Because why would you even bother? And you describe such a complicated process and a lot of intentions and thinking and planning that goes into it. But I don't see why, if a piece of art was already out there and has already succeeded, I'm not a musician. I only study music in like other contexts in resistance and politics, but not in this way. So I'm like, why do that? And is it, I made it that far that I can do it and know that it will have certain implications? So can you clarify any of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, right? It's really only artists at the same level as Taylor Swift, right? Okay, there's almost no artist at the same level as Taylor Swift right now. If her current tour is any indication, which not only is the first tour to cross the $1 billion mark, but it's gonna, just the North American legs of her tour are gonna make over $2 billion, right? She basically saved the US economy from going into a recession. But yeah, like, she is someone who has gotten to, I was being a bit facetious there, by the way. She didn't save us from a recession single-handedly. It was her and Beyonce together did it. Yeah, it's someone of her status, right, can finance this herself, essentially, right? And as you said, the re-recording process is a highly technical process. It's a process where you need to hire studio musicians to go into the studio to record guitar part after guitar part after guitar part, bass part after bass part after bass part, drum part after drum part after drum part, and then having producers and audio engineers who are capable of splicing, parts of all of these takes together in such a way that you're able to replicate it, right? So it's a technically demanding and difficult process, right? And so therefore it's going to cost a lot of money to do this, right? And Taylor Swift is someone who would be able to self-finance this, but most artists, right, if they're going to get screwed over by their record label, they're just going to get screwed over by their record label, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so I think, I don't want to be, put out there that like Taylor Swift is a social justice warrior, right? Largely what she's doing for selfish reasons. And I think they're perfectly fine selfish reasons in this case, but she is helping to expose to, the extent that she can, given the largeness of her audience and just how intense her audience is, or at least can be, right? She's exposing to those people just how messed up the recording industry is, right? And is really training them to think more critically about the ethical implications of their music consumption habits, right? And so she urged her fans not to stream the original albums, which her fans call the stolen versions, right? Not to stream those on Spotify, right? And so fans have gone on Reddit and various other online forums to tell each other how to basically trick the Spotify algorithm so that they avoid the original versions ever appearing, right? And so, she's helping to train her, again, I'll just repeat what I said. She's helping to train her audience, her fans, into thinking more critically about what they're doing when they're streaming music, when they're buying music, and so forth. And, I think that that's an important thing that she's doing. But again, as you mentioned, she can only do that because of her status in the music industry, right? And her outsized status in the music industry. You know, an artist starting out, you know, she wouldn't have been able to do this 10 years ago, right? But it's only because of her success that she's capable of doing this, right? And that it matters that she's doing it, right? Similar to back in the 90s when Prince changed his name to a symbol, right? Which he did for selfish reasons, right? Universal Music, who I think it was Universal Music, who was his recording company, owned his name. And so he could not record under his name. And so he changed his name to a symbol, right? And it only mattered because he was fucking Prince, right? Who's like the biggest funk artist of that, you know, 80s and 90s, right? No one's bigger than Prince, and crossover into pop success, right? Prince can do that. And so once you get into a position of authority, right, you could just sort of hoard your wealth, sell out, or, you know, you could do something, take a stand to, you know, in a way, perhaps help to benefit other artists. Now, one problem with what Taylor Swift has done is that how the record companies have responded is to make the time period for when artists are allowed to re-record their albums, because those are built into recording contracts, right? Typically it's like 5 years, right? Record companies have responded by making that time period longer, right? And so it would take you longer to re-record your album. Back in the 60s, it was like a 2-year period, right? And so tracks released 2 years later, you can re-record it with another company and they can make money off it, not the original, right? So does that address your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Actually,
Awesome.
Can I add one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
How would AI change any of that?
AI changes everything, right? So that's interesting. And I think the way to think about that is maybe so far, at least US courts have found that any art produced by AI cannot be copyrighted, meaning you can't make money off it. At least legally, you can't make money off it. And so, you know, if, you know, some music company were just to use AI to re-record her albums, right, which it could potentially do, although it's not clear if that would be just like a means of digital or mechanical reproduction, right, in which case they're just producing copies which the copyright holder would own. But even if that weren't the case, still you're producing something that isn't copywritten, that can't be copywritten, and therefore, you know, at least legally can't be monetized, right? So it's essentially you've put it in the public domain, right? But I'm not really an expert in the AI stuff, but so I'm just basing this on what I presently understand the case to be. But that's a really good question. I love that.
Can you give us a picture of how different each album musicians are, like from the first recording to the next to the re-recording? Are they radically different, or share some musicians? And how much effort is it for Taylor to re-sing the vocals? Not very much, or what do you like? How many takes is she doing?
Yeah.
Like I was just thinking two sides of this. Like, is it a lot of work for other people and not a lot of work for her? And then if it's a lot of work for her, why wouldn't she want to just write music?
Yeah, good. Right. And so with respect to the first question, the personnel is basically some of them are the same, some of them are different. Right. That's basically it. And so, for example, on Red, she has a song called Everything Has Changed, which was a duet with Ed Sheeran that she co-wrote and sang with him. Right. And Ed Sheeran appears on Taylor's version of Everything Has Changed. Right. And so, you know, like the big name people are the same, but the studio musicians, the people who would have been paid by the session for, you know, by the hour, those people have largely been switched out as far as I know. And it's basically the musicians she's been working with most recently are the ones appearing on the re-recordings. But as regarding your second question, I think I honestly don't know how many takes she's doing, right? I would guess she's doing dozens of takes per track, but most of the work is coming probably from the audio engineers, right? Which I think is the case with most pop music anyway, right? Most of the work is done by the editor, the audio engineer, the producer, finding the right takes. And in this case, right, it's not finding the right takes to like fulfill the vibe or whatever that the artist is intending, but rather comparing it to the original and being like, yeah, this is close enough, right? And the differences that you spot largely aren't of the music, right? The music sounds damn near perfect across the board. Now, there are some cases where I forget the track, but there's an example where a guitar is replaced by a synth, right? And it's a noticeable difference. But by and large, musically, the instrumentation's the same, the arrangements are the same. You couldn't tell the difference. If you're going to spot differences, it's in her vocal performance, right? Because Taylor Swift, 31, 32-year-old, isn't trying to sound like Taylor Swift, 17-year-old, right? She sounds more mature. She sounds more confident. There's less vocal fry, for example. On the countryer songs, there's less twang to her voice, right? And so it largely sounds the same, but there are differences, especially if you're listening out for them. And a lot of my students who are Taylor Swift fans grew up listening to her music, and they can spot the differences almost immediately, right? It's sort of like uncanny valley stuff where it's like, ooh, this is the same, but it's not the same. And so it's like a David Lynch version of listening to this album or song that they grew up with, right? And some fans are turned off by that, right? That they want to support Taylor Swift, but they want to keep listening to the originals. And so they need to think about again, sort of critically think about their consumption practices. And so it's okay, well, I don't own a copy of the CD that I bought pre Big Machine Records being sold to Scooter Braun. So I will buy a used copy of it, right? Scooter Braun doesn't make money that way, and I can listen to the original, right? Or I will just illegally download it, right? Taylor Swift would still make money from digital downloads of her original back catalog, but it would be in the neighborhood of 13%, right? Whereas with the Taylor's versions, she owns them. So her company gets 100% of the royalties, right? And so, financially it's different, but there is that ethical calculation. But Jamie, was your question more along the lines of like, because this is something I've been thinking about too, is like the actual ethics of the re-recording process, right? That she's replacing musicians, right? So their signature isn't appearing on the re-recording, right? And if it's easy for her, just go in, bang out 10 takes and then move on to the next song, bang out 10 takes, move on to the next song, right? Sort of assembly line approach for her, which I sort of assume it would be, right? And it's not that hard for her, and she's making other people do the work. Like, how much can we find her morally praiseworthy for what she's doing? Were you thinking along those lines?
I guess I was thinking about like questions of authenticity. Like, is it in the production of an album, you're working with people originally, you're creating something, creating something, and it doesn't seem like this is like the versions are different. That's what she already exists, and she's like, play these tracks for me, right? And everyone plays the track, and then she's not really, like there's no like I'm wondering what the creative experience is like.
Yeah.
Is it different for her? And
Yeah.
different for the musicians that are trying to make the album. And so I guess my question is more about like the relationship between authenticity and what we value in music.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And Right, because that's exactly right. That, 17-year-old Taylor Swift going into the studio to record Fearless and to record, all of the tracks on that album, right? She's pouring her heart out then, right? That this is how I feel now. I wrote these songs that capture how I feel now, and I'm going to, uh, you know, put my everything into it and do my best and put it out in the world and hope it goes well. Right. Versus 32-year-old Taylor Swift, 31-year-old Taylor Swift, whatever, going into the studio and is like, all right, I'm basically going to do what I did then. Right. That seems like a technical challenge, not really an artistic or aesthetic one. Right. Just it's very much just like hit the notes basically the way I hit them then and rely on my producers and engineers to put them together in such a way that everything sounds right. But I think on that question, right, I think you can ask the same thing about live performance. Right. And so a band, an artist playing a song live time and time again to the point where it's like, yeah, I don't really feel this anymore, but my fans want to hear it. They came out to hear this song, and so I guess we'll play it, right? And so when Radiohead stopped performing Creep, right, because Tom York and maybe the rest of the band really started to hate how successful it was and didn't want to play it anymore, right? And then, however many years later, they put it back in the set list, right? Like, has their attitude changed towards it, or is it just like, yeah, the fans want to hear it, so we'll give the fans what they want, right? So there's that authenticity question there for live performance, right? But I do think it's even more pressing in the recording case, right? Because of just like the technical challenge, performing a song live just is, takes 5 minutes or whatever, but laying it down in a studio, that's like many tens of hours, if not hundreds of hours of process, right? Yeah.
Radiohead also released a new version of Creep, which sounds more like a cover than a version.
I don't know if I've heard that.
I think it's under Tom York's name, but it's much more moody, and it doesn't have the guitar Johnny Greenwood.
Oh,
Distinctive guitar sound, which Johnny Greenwood made because he hated the song in the beginning, right? So like the distinctive thing that everyone liked.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, awesome.
But I guess I would wonder, like, does Taylor Swift's re-recording change the way we think about like covers and versions and those kinds of, like, do you think that these re-recordings are changing the way that people are thinking about how we make those distinctions between original cover and version?
Yeah, I think
And
so.
remaster.
Right. And so that's one thing I mentioned at the very end is remastering, right? And I think that's a case where you have two albums that sound different, but they're the same album, at least potentially. Right. Just, the stereo mix versus the mono mix of, Bob Dylan's first three albums, which were originally released in mono, right? Like, I feel like those are the same albums, right? And what the different mixes do, this is how I think about it, and I'll just float it and see what you think, is what those different mixes do is just give you access to it differently. Just in the way that, me listening to the song on an MP3 player, right? Like Winamp back in the day, where it's like, 96 kps, so it's hyper compressed, right? And so the dynamic range is limited, and the high and low is restricted as well, right? Like that gives me different access than listening to it on vinyl on a high-end stereo system, right? And so me listening to my CD on my crappy boombox versus me listening to my CD on, the $30,000 high-end stereo equipment, right? Like they're different experiences. They're going to sound different, but they're the one in the same CD. They're the same album, right? And so that's how I think of remasters largely. Right now, if a remaster is like, so for example, and this is, I mean, so every remaster is a remix. Okay, like that's something important to say. I just got a copy of the original album on vinyl, which I'm pumped about. So that's why I'm going to use this as an example. So Funkadelic's Maggot Brain, right? 1970 seminal psychedelic funk album, right? The title track on the original is, you have sort of the drum, bass, rhythm guitar buried in the track. It's barely audible, right? And the majority of the 10 minutes is just Eddie Hazel shredding on guitar, right? And it's magical, right? When they remastered the album, they released as a bonus track the version of it where the rhythm section is back in the mix. So you can actually hear the interplay between the various instruments, right? That's a case where, right, it's giving you different access to the original recording, right? It's, the original recording sessions, nothing's been re-recorded. The mix has been different, but the outcome is so radically different from the original that I want to say that, okay, that remix, that's a different track, right, than the original mix. But just a remaster where you like shift from 2-channel stereo to 5.1 or 7.1 Dolby Digital, or to like Sony Atmos, which is like 96 channel or whatever, right? Like, yeah, you're having a different sort of experience. Yeah, it may sound different, but in those cases, I'm more comfortable saying it's different experience of the same thing, not different thing, if that makes sense. But on the covers, on the covers question, a chapter in the book by P.D. Magnus, Kristen Magnus, Christy McGuire, and Rob McClamrock is dealing with the question of, are Taylor's versions cover versions? Or at least what can thinking about them through the lens of cover versions help us to understand about them as the sorts of musical objects that they are?
Well, let's thank Brandon for sharing this with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And next week we don't have a talk, right? Going on forward. And thank you, Brandon. It's been awesome, and we're looking forward to the book coming out.
Awesome. I'll keep you posted.
All right.
Thanks.
I'll
I'm gonna
take
take off. Take care.